Let me close this so I don't get feedback. Hi. So we are live with Kent Smith. And so Kent, just so you know, the last 15 minutes, Hillary and I were sitting here telling appreciation stories about you. So we we didn't know how long we'd fill in, but after about 15 minutes of that, we decided that as John likes to call you, the absent-minded professor, you probably were going to show up at 2 instead of 1. So welcome. We're glad you're here, and we were still here. I'm wondering, why don't we check in?
Sure.
I did comment too on how wonderful it is that everyone gets to know the real you.
That's right. Yes.
We're not going to put on any airs today. We're going to make sure.
No chance of me maintaining that flawless image, it sounds like.
That's right. Too funny. All right. You want to check in first? You want me to
go? Sure. I'll be glad to. Well, I've got lots of gratitudes this week, but one that I'll tell for this purpose came in my email this week from my friend John White. So John sent me a communication that he was having with several other people in the Luke 10 community that really thrilled my heart, because it was a conversation about regional centers. So I am deeply invested in the idea that the life of God needs to be lived out in demonstration plots. It needs to happen in places where people can see what it looks like and feel what it looks like, and talk to the real folks who are engaged in this life. And as you know, and as we'll probably get into, I'm deeply involved in some experiments along those lines here in Abilene. And so to learn how many people within our wider community are thinking similar things, what would it be like to have a place locally, some folks in Alaska and some folks in Idaho, Wyoming, and some folks out in, I think, North Carolina, all thinking similar thoughts. And so anyway, who knows where that will go, but the fact that others are deeply interested in thinking about this kind of training and the possibilities of how that could impact our whole ecosystem is very exciting to me. So that made me smile, and it warmed my heart to think about some of those good people that John was in conversation with, and made me look forward to seeing more of them and really of all the people that are part of our community coming up here soon. So that's my appreciation story today.
Thank you. Any other check-in you might have, or just joy, excitement, anything else there?
Yeah, I think there are several current things that are exciting for us around here. I guess the other note that I think is very real for me is that my dad and I had a great conversation on Sunday. My mom is 93. Dad is just turned 90. Mom's about to be 93. And they're just older, and it's hard to be far from them. They're in Kentucky. We're in Texas. And so I miss them. And especially in this season of life when the needs are pretty intense for them, I feel some real tenderness for them, especially for Dad, who has pretty much all of Mother's care in his hands. So feeling that sort of a background tenderness that I carry a lot of the time these days. So that's kind of where I am today.
Thank you for sharing that. That brings up some very fascinating questions in my mind. And maybe I'll ask them later, because I want people to get to know you first before I start asking you questions. Thank you for sharing that. I am excited to be interviewing you. I said before you came on, you're almost like the secret weapon in Luke 10 because a lot of people don't know who you are or get to be with you very often. And so, and yet you're quite a force to reckon with. So, so I was super excited about getting the opportunity to, for people to get to know you. So I'm excited to be here. I am a little tired, I think. And this isn't my last thing. So after this, I just take the rest of the day off and rest. So I'm looking forward to resting some and playing with the kids. And that's me. I'm in.
Thank you.
So you've shared a little bit about your family, but let's just start with, where are you right now? People might not know where you're living. And what do what's your family makeup look like? And what does your work life look like? Just so people can get to know you in your element. Hillary, her appreciation story was you in your element, and she shared the picture of you with your hat on and out in nature at the Eden Center. And so, you just tell us a little bit about what is that. People might hear this Eden Center and they might not have any idea what that is. So, where are you? Your family makeup, and then your local work.
Sure. So I'm in Abilene, Texas. I've lived here for about 32 years now. In my 32nd year here, I'm a native Midwesterner, so Texas is not my home. And if I had anything to say about it, it never would have been my home. But you know how that works. But I'm delighted to be in Abilene at this point, and have family that is comprised of my wife, Karen. We have 5 children, adult children, and 11 grandchildren. And many of them are right here. Nearly all of them live in town or close to us. Some of the grandchildren are now away from us, but that's been one of the great unexpected blessings of being here, is just having so much of our family, biological family, close to us. My work for 30, going on 2 years now, has been teaching at Abilene Christian University as a teacher in the College of Biblical Studies, and more specifically, most of my work through the seminary here, the Graduate School of Theology, where I've taught missions and trained mission teams for especially North America, but really all over the world for a big part of that time. Let's see, what else is my work? Well, as we'll talk about in a bit, a lot of my work these days is with the Eden community, community I co-founded with Karen about 8 years ago. And the Eden Center for Regenerative Culture, which is a 92-acre piece of land and in development as a home and as a center for training in a better way of life, training people how to live well as vibrant families of Jesus in fellowship with the good world that God has made. And that's a big project, lots of moving parts around that. And then, of course, Luke 10. John and I co-founded Luke 10 long ago. We'll probably get into that. And it's my joy to get to work with Tony and the rest of the leadership team at Luke 10 and be a part of this amazing, now worldwide community. So maybe that's enough in general about me.
That's good. I'm probably going to go way off script for like the questions I was handed.
What a stop.
So I'm curious, Kent, I find it fascinating that you have been a professor in a seminary, right? Especially when you hear John and how verbally he comes out against seminary. So this is fascinating, is it not? That this man is so radically against education in seminaries the way it's done today, and yet you actually are in a seminary teaching, and you've been doing it for so long. So I'd love to hear from you the difference in your personality that would help you, that would motivate you to do such a thing. Like, and how have you endured? Why have you endured? Why have you done this for this long? And what's motivated you, and how have you approached it?
Yeah. Well, that is a great question. Just as a fun little side note, uh, I love it that John is a critique of seminary, but I also love it that he regularly pulls out his Greek and all of the knowledge that he gained in seminary to share with the rest of us. So it's nice to have an occasion to point that out. You know, I think John and lots of other thoughtful people have raised very legitimate concerns about seminary, and a lot of people in the seminary would agree with a lot of the critique there. I think one of the things that we're doing in Luke 10 that is finding resonance with lots of folks, certainly the Life Model Works tribe, but more broadly, people who are thinking about the whole brain and what it means to have a whole life as a follower of Jesus, is the recognition that all too often the Western academy has been kind of constrained and co-opted into a very left brain approach to knowledge, and that's a mistake and a tragedy, and there are all kinds of things that flow out of that, but it's also part of the broader flow of just Western life in general over the past centuries. But that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of people who are true lovers of God and lovers of people in seminary. I certainly work alongside some amazing disciples of Jesus in this work, and that's been a great part of my joy here. And I think, you can, at one point in my younger life, when I was going to seminary myself in Memphis, probably when you were a tiny girl, that I was walking one of Memphis's golf courses with one of my professors, who had heard me just burst out in frustration in class one day that week about how messed up the church was, and he said, "Ken, let's go golfing," and then proceeded with great wisdom to listen to me rant for about 9 holes on everything that was wrong with the church. And at the end of that time, he very graciously said, "Kent, I think you have really nailed a lot of things right on the head. It's so true, the critique that you're offering. And you may well decide to leave this church." But he said, before you do that, I really want you to think about a couple of things. He said, for whatever reason and by whatever means, God somehow found you in this church, brought you to love God, and has equipped and empowered you to be a leader among God's people right through this church, this fatally flawed church that you were just describing. And that's something to think about. God somehow found you in this church. And if you leave, you with insight about what needs to be changed, what needs to be fixed, where will that leave the church? And what will you do? And that was a timely word for me as probably a 23-year-old or something at the time, to be challenged to think about, if not this, then what else? And what is my, he said a third thing that I didn't mention. He said, and you've got a legacy here. People know you, people know your family. There's a heritage here. There's an opportunity, and that's really a gift. And if you step away from this, you will walk away from that sort of head start on having a good influence. So think about those things before you make that decision. And that has been good for me to think about that since then. I have done all kinds of things along the way to work from inside church structures as well as alongside and outside of church structures to see what we can do to help the body of Christ take on more of the form that God's calling us to. But anyway, that's a bit of my response to why I'm still in seminary. I get to work with amazing people. I get to work with incredible young people who are all about finding out what their calling is. And, So the privilege of walking alongside hundreds and hundreds of folks over all these years is something that I don't want to take for granted.
Yeah. And I imagine your classes are probably a little more whole-brained than one would find in other seminaries, possibly. So I can only imagine.
We try, you learn, you try to pass along what you're learning, for sure.
So when did your path intersect with John White then? And how did this whole thing called Luke 10 begin from your perspective?
Well, so yeah, there's lots of places to start on telling the backstory here. I'll just start in 2002. Karen and I were in England. I had been teaching here at that point about 12 years, and we were just getting a really good deep look at what life in a post-Christendom society looks like. I think at the time they said that maybe 1.5% of the British population were in church on a given week. And that was obviously lower than what we'd been seeing in the US at the time. But I could see the trends, and to see how, how largely irrelevant the church was perceived to be in British society and in Europe in general at the time. And then also to see the people working right out at the fringes, mostly invisible underground, who are doing amazing things to begin to reimagine what life in the kingdom could look like. That was a great informative year for me and for Karen. We had just the year prior to that had made a decision to move to a network of home churches in our own expression here back in the States. And so I was just getting curious at that point about who else is doing this kind of stuff in the U.S. at this time. And so did some research.
I'm going to stop you because I have a question about your formation, just a little bit.
You bet.
Because you strike me as a cultural anthropologist. And I don't know if you ever studied cultural anthropology, but you really have a different view of everything constantly than most people, right? You're looking at the bigger picture. You're looking at culture and shifting culture and changing. When did that begin? And this might be where it began, but it sounds even like that was in you way before you got to England. So would you just share just a minute about where that passion came from? Because it's going to come up. It's going to come up. And I want to know, was that just your design? Were you born that way? Or did you study and it shaped your formation? Like, where did that come from?
Well, that's the danger of asking a 67-year-old to tell me what's behind this. You just there's a lot of places to go back behind whatever you talk about. The quick answer is that I grew up in a church planting home. My mom and dad they would have considered themselves missionaries to North America back in the day, in the 50s and late 50s, early 60s in Wisconsin, Illinois, Northern Indiana, where they were doing some church planting. And so that was the matrix of life that I found myself in as a young person. And I often tell the story of the day in the West Chicago High School hall when I was walking down the hall and a drug dealer walked up to me and said, "Hey, Smith, do you believe in God?" And it was a moment where I really wanted to just turn around and run, because this guy's a crazy guy. He a year before, he had given me my one tattoo in my right thigh with a number 2 pencil. Just walked by, and he was just randomly doing things like that to intimidate and harm people. And so I wanted to run, but I didn't. I managed to stay put. I looked him in the eye and I said, "Yes, I do believe in God." And what happened next really shocked me, because his eyes welled up with tears. And he said, "Well, then why did God let my brother die in Vietnam last year?" And he turned on his heel and walked away. He wasn't waiting for my answer. And I didn't have one, but I did have a question that emerged from his question, because I knew a lot of people like him in my high school that didn't have my background, didn't know about God through their life experience. And the question that began to form for me in that season of my life, and that event kind of crystallized for me, was, what will it take for ordinary people to know God for who God really is in our time? And that kind of lit a fire in me. I began to really study, how do you share your faith? How do people come to Christ? What does it take to introduce a person who doesn't know God to Christ and to the life that God has invited us to? So, fast forward 4 or 5 years, I have memorized a half a dozen evangelism techniques. I've been studying my Bible ferociously. I'm an undergraduate student at Harding University in Arkansas, and I've led a campaign group of about 25, mostly college-aged folks, to the Pacific Northwest, and we spend six weeks, 2 weeks each in Washington State, Idaho, and Montana, sharing our faith, cold call evangelism, knocking on doors. Hey, would you like to study the Bible, kind of thing. And in 6 weeks, we baptized 26 people. And so I was just elated. I was walking on clouds for the next year. But then I decided to go back and see those people the following summer. And when I began to walk up to their doorsteps once again and knock on those doors, I had the same experience over and over again. People would see me, their eyes would hit the ground, and it would become pretty obvious pretty soon they were not glad to see me. And when I probed that a little bit, the basic message I got over and over was, Kent, you lied to us. You told us about this amazing new life that goes on forever and a family that we would have forever. But, since you left, we haven't heard anything more from you, and we've never seen anything of this eternal family you're telling me about. And so, not interested.
Wow.
And it was a kick to the gut. It was one of the most emotionally painful moments in my life when I realized I've probably hurt these people more than I helped them. I thought I was sharing good news, but what I was really doing was inoculating them to the good news.
Wow.
So that experience sent me back to the drawing board, and the question, I was doing an undergraduate degree in biology with a focus on ecology, field biology and ecology. And the longer I kind of lived in that world, the more I realized, easy solutions with a simple, 1-2 cause and effect relationship are almost non-existent in the real world. So just tell people this story, get them to make a decision, and bang, you're done, is simply out of touch with the way things really are. Because in a real life experience, there are so many dimensions to it. You have to think systemically. You have to think broadly about what are all the factors here that make this sustainable, make this life-giving, that make this regenerative. And so that sort of systemic perspective pressed me more and more. I already had some instincts for this, into the importance of beginning to think about our life together as something that needs to be demonstrated in a not in a 1.5 hour Bible study, but in a whole way of life that is being lived out by a community. That was really brought home to me probably 5 or 6 years later, when I was preaching for a little church in southern Wisconsin. And I met a guy named John who was an atheist. And I found out sort of through his wife that John liked to canoe and liked to fly fish. And so John and I started going canoe camping together on weekends. We'd take off and spend a day or 2 or 3 on the water, and started bringing some buddies along. I had a friend who is a airline pilot and a fairly new Christian, occasional pot smoker, still trying to sort out what life in the kingdom looked like. The other buddy who is a recovering, sometimes not so recovered alcoholic. And the 4 of us would get on the water some. So 3 years into that process, we're on our way home. We're almost home, and John looks over at me, and John's been hanging out with us more and more in the last 6 months or so, and just sharing life with us some. And he said, Kent, I love what you guys are doing, and I love you people. And if I didn't have to put my brain in a basket, I'd probably be right in the middle with you. And so when we got home, I said, John, give me just a second. I ran in the house. I got a copy of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's wonderful little book, handed it to him and said, read this, John. And if you ever want to, I'd love to talk to you about this. So about 2 weeks later, I hadn't heard anything from him. But one morning, the phone rings, and it's John. And his first words are, Kent, I'm ready to follow Jesus. When can I be baptized? Mm-hmm. And, it was, it was so beautiful. And it was, as I talked to John a little later, it was the life that looked so beautiful to him, so exciting to him, that he was looking for a reason to follow Jesus. He was looking for a way to make make sense so that he could do it. And it made me think again of how Jesus talks about how when people see the real kingdom, it's like this treasure that's been hidden from them in a field. And when they see it, their first impulse is cover it up, run, sell everything I've got with joy, and buy that field. That was John's reaction to what he had been witnessing. And that has kind of had me on a relentless pursuit ever since of this thicker life together that is the good news that Jesus came to proclaim. So that's a little bit more backstory.
Yeah. So it sounds like these experiences that kind of deconstructed the way we were doing evangelism, the way we were even thinking about evangelism as a prayer that you say, and you now have a relationship with God, as opposed to it's a family you join, it's a community that you become part of, and it's a relationship with God in the flesh as well around you, as well as with God internally with you. And you were on this quest for then what will it take for ordinary people to come to know God in this fullness and in this, you like to say, the manifold, the multifaceted wisdom of God through his people that love him and know him. And that ended up leading you to England, and that's where you were when I interrupted you. But on your way to meeting John White, or at least connecting with John White somehow. So we're still waiting for that wonderful moment, but go for it.
Yeah, well, thank you for pushing for more backstory, because that is important, obviously, and everything that has come since. So while we were in England, we're reaching out to people, and I learned of the work of a couple of British physicians who had moved to the States and were working on a house church movement called Tony and Felicity Dale. And so I reached out to Tony while we were still in Oxford and said, Tony, told him a little bit about my story and situation, and said, hey, I'd love to meet you when I get back to the States. And he very graciously invited me and Karen to come down to their home for a gathering that year in 2002 in the spring. And then that summer they were having a house-to-house conference in Dallas. And even before we got there, Tony said, man, there's some people I really want to introduce you to. One of these guys is a fellow named John White. I think you and John would just hit it off. And sure enough, met John that first day of the conference, and we became fast friends and have been hanging out ever since. So that's how we met.
I've never put this together, but I think from listening to Jim and Kathy's interview, they also met John White at Tony and Felicity Dale's house. Yes. Maybe before that conference, or maybe it was the conference, but John said like 150 people showed up in their house.
Yes.
And Jim was one of them. And I think that's where they met as well. So we really owe the whole founding of Luke 10 to Tony and Felicity Dale. I mean, that's really what this comes down to.
They were
blessings to
them. Absolutely. They were a couple of physicians, so credentialed, licensed physicians in England who moved to the U.S. and suddenly were nobody, because they couldn't practice medicine in the U.S. There's a whole huge new set of hurdles for getting credentialed as a physician in the U.S. But they came because they felt like the experience they'd had of simple organic church in England was something God wanted to bring to the U.S. So
Wow.
yes, absolutely, we can't overstate the debt
we need
we
to
all
interview
owe.
them next year.
Yeah, absolutely. They're such amazing followers of Jesus in such an amazing way. And they actually had meetings in their house over about a 5 or 6 year period there, where they would gather groups of people. Many of the best known folks in the organic and simple and emerging church world were part of those conversations.
So we're going to pick up in just a minute on what attracted you to John and how you guys ended up together. But I'd like to pause that story for 1 second, because I think it was about around that time, but it might have been much later. And I want the story of how you ended up finding out about Sociocracy. And if it's much later, then you can start here and tell me when we get there. But when did that start getting your attention and you heard about it, and how did you connect with that? Because that's a huge piece of our governing process here. And it is very new, I think, for most organizations. And you're kind of the bringer of that good news to us. So tell me a little bit about that, unless it comes way later in the story.
Not way later, but it does come some later. Why don't we keep on this track, and then don't let me forget to mention that as we get closer to where that happened.
All right, sounds good. And I will so far just point out an observation I'm making too about something unique about you that seems to be happening throughout your whole journey is an aspect of you as a bridge builder. That uniquely you seem to be able to connect with people that believe different things, people, non-Christians, hanging out with people smoking pot. Like, a lot of Christians can't do that without telling them they're wrong, right? Like, you had, even way back when you were young, this way of being in the world where you didn't seem to judge people, condemn people, but yet build bridges between people who might think differently or have different philosophies of life or ways of seeing church even, or whatever. And I think that's going to lead into your future story too. But I just think that's fascinating. And I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, or if we just want to notice it and you go on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for noticing that. I think, it's probably largely just a gift that God deposited in me as a 9 on the Enneagram. I'm kind of a even keel, always curious, interested in what's going on with other people, seeing multiple perspectives. I'm just kind of wired to be listening to folks kind of where they are and thinking about how that connects with other things. That's just, I don't think there's no bragging rights there. It's just kind of how I'm wired. But I'm grateful for it, because it has been a big blessing.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you. Go for it.
Well, so John and I met in 2003, and we're pretty quickly drawn into an organization called Dawn. And if you hear John tell the story, he talks a good bit about Dawn, Discipling a Whole Nation. It was a church planting movement initiated by a gentleman named Jim Montgomery. And at that point, Dawn was in all over the world. We had huge funding, largely through one foundation, but it was on all continents. And the people in Dawn had realized, oh yeah, and North America is actually a mission field too. There's a need for church planting movements here as well. So much like the folks at ACU who invited me to come work on North America at ACU, Dawn was saying, yeah, let's take North America seriously as a mission field in this time. And so John and I ended up on the North American team for Dawn. And we began to develop what came to be called in Dawn circles, organic Dawn. So it was just thinking about how do we start from the grassroots up, as opposed to trying to launch things from orchestrated large church merger level conversations at the city or region level. And Dawn came to an end in about 2006, 7. It kind of went over several period time in several years. And John and I felt like, the thing we've begun to do with Organic Dawn needs to carry on. It needs to keep going. And so Luke 10 was born out of that conviction that these vibrant families of Jesus we were seeing emerge here and there and working to see happen really need a lot of support. We could tell that there was a movement underway. That was certainly what the Dales had been fomenting, and a lot of other folks with them in the movement that they were helping lead. But we could tell lots of people didn't really know what to do with that. They knew how to do church, and church was a gathering where you had preaching and you had singing and you had the communion and you had the Lord's Supper, and but folks didn't know how to do life together. Really, they knew how to do an event, but that event didn't translate nicely into a living room the same way. Preaching wasn't so good. The kids were a total distraction to the main thing we thought we were trying to do. The singing was pitiful at best, on and on. It wasn't church in a very high quality way. And people who are used to going to the services where they were nicely served by a group of professionals found that pretty discouraging pretty quickly. So a lot of folks were trying house church, they would call it, for 3 months or 6 months or a year and burning out on it, getting exhausted and saying, okay, been there, done that. What process John and I started calling Honey, I Shrunk the Church. They had just taken their imagination of what church was, an event that was run by professionals, tried to pull it off as amateurs, and then decided that wasn't for them, understandably, and there was an element of that. There were folks that were saying, we just need to get more concerned about the poor or the environment or other areas of real need in the world that they were seeing. And but you try to do that in a living room and layer on a few extra meetings a week trying to do some of those other things, and you burn out in a hurry. So we knew that
children in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. We knew that people needed a lot more help than they realized they needed to move from church as they knew it to something that was more truly organic, more truly family centered, more truly about a way of life in community than simply running a series of meetings. But most folks had almost no or zero actual experience with that. So as we launched Luke 10, we began to experiment then with, well, how could we begin to introduce people into some of the basic rhythms of this way of life? And that got us started, at least on how we were going to hopefully be helpful to the folks in Luke 10.
That's incredible. An incredible story of, and I'm also thinking of just what God was doing in so many other people at that time to bring us all to where we are today, right? Like with so many different movements, with Life Model Works and Thrive, and all these people were in the same time you were, and God was calling them out, preparing them, giving them a piece of this relational revolution that's now we're seeing the fruit of. But this was like the skunk works, like really, like John's been talking about, of this was just so unheard of, what y'all were pioneering back then. And it was really only heard of on the mission field, right? Like that's why Matt and I left. I mean, because church planting still in the U.S. was just barely a thing. But yet we could go to a different country where the church didn't have a hold at all. And we could reimagine what church really could be like in a totally different way. So we didn't have to do it a certain way. No one was telling us to do it a certain way. So we really had the freedom and the support of institutional churches in the States to do that. But here in the States, who would have funded that, right? Who would have actually given and supported that, or even understood why you were doing it? And I think it's just incredible, that y'all were relentlessly pursuing this passion, each of you, that, and we'll hear John's later if we haven't heard it already, but those passions, those callings inside of both of you.
Hmm.
If you had to say, how has God used Luke 10 in your own life? Now that's kind of weird because you founded it. But I mean, it's been going for, 12 years now, I guess. And really for the last 7 years, kind of taking off and building more community around it. How has it impacted your life or blessed you in a way? What do you most appreciate about it would be another way to ask that question.
Well, one of my motives, this not the motive, but a motive for me, was that we had begun a program after we came back from England here in the graduate school to make graduate seminary training more whole brain, more whole life, less simply a matter of exercise in the gathering of information and truth. And that program, which was called the Missionary Residency for North America, MYRNA, was a process that Karen and I got to kind of nurture and shepherd over 12 years or so. So we worked with dozens, ultimately 70 or 80 master's level students through that process. And as we were doing that, I was realizing, I love these young people. I'm, you pour into folks for 12 or 18 months as family, and the end of that time is like, oh man, and they're going, and I simply don't have the bandwidth, the capacity to continue to walk with them. We need some ways for them to continue to be supported and nurtured. And so John and I were concurrently working with Dawn at the time, and then with Luke 10, it was just like, okay, here is a segue for some of these students anyway to continue to connect with each other. But the big burning question that was very much on John's mind and mine too was, how do we see vibrant families of Jesus being formed everywhere, close reach of everyone? How do we see the viral movement that it would take to produce that, that is both transformative enough, so it's changing our lives, but also viral enough, easily replicated enough for that to go out to all the world? And we just started experimenting. We're both teacher, preacher, trainers by design in a lot of ways, and so we started experimenting with things we could share with people. We developed, as you might not be surprised, some courses to help people. But fairly early on, we had the grace of being introduced to the little sachet tool. And that, I think, was one of the ways that God really began to open my eyes to how critically important it is to teach people skills that they don't know, that are not information-based, but rather relationally based. So the little sachet tool that we use all the time in Luke 10. And then as we got more familiar a little later on to the importance of appreciation and including those things as a way of really connecting with the whole brain, the whole person, whether that's a human or the Lord that we're interacting with. That became a revelation to me, I think, and to us, as it was becoming a revelation to people that Luke 10 was touching. And we've just seen that obviously continue to grow and multiply. It became a huge blessing to our students to be trained in those things. John came probably the second or third year into the MYRNA program and joined us, and it was a little much for him, I have to tell you. John wanted with a group of 20-something seminarians from a mostly left brain tradition was a little bit of a culture shock, probably for him, but certainly for them. But it was also great. And some of those people, a number of those young people are still my dear friends and coworkers here in Abilene, and I'm sure John had no little part in helping them make the transition to such a radical thing.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that Luke 10 has had an impact on you both personally and professionally. Personally, in that it's helped you mature emotionally, it sounds like, and learn how to help others mature emotionally through just some basic relational skill practice that's not that hard, that if people practice, they would grow an emotional capacity to connect heart to heart with each other and with God. So that was something personal for you that helped your own life and your own family possibly, but also in training and equipping, it gave you some more confidence in how to do that well. And then it also sounds like professionally, it's been a meaningful for you because you've formed these strong bonds with students, and yet can't necessarily walk with them on the field and stay in connection with them like that. But to be able to help give them belonging to a family that's bigger than yourself, that they can connect with if they want to, and continue training with even while they're on the field, felt like a support for what you were doing locally there in Abilene.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a undescribable gift to get to walk alongside the developing Luke 10 community and see how the Luke 10 community blesses and has blessed so many people that I have known and worked with over the years, but also how we have been recipients of a lot of the blessings of those people too. At this season, they're coming back around. So people like Dennis and others that are blessing the ecosystem.
Okay, so I'm going to shift just slightly because one of your deepest passions, I think, as I've experienced you, is this concept of intergenerational, intentional, regenerative community. And that is expressed in the Eden Center right now as kind of a, what did you call it? You called it a demonstration plot. But a place where people could actually go and maybe even experience what you're talking about, because it seems like you have imprinted in you this vision, this imagination, so to speak, for what Christian community could be like. And it's not seen in the world very often. Almost like when it reminds me when Jesus was here and he taught parables, and he talked about the kingdom of God is like, because it was almost like this kingdom, no one had ever experienced it. They'd never seen it. They'd never touched it. They couldn't even imagine what it was. And the only way he could help them was to break their paradigms and their imagination with these crazy parables, right? And you refer to the one of selling everything you have to go grab that in the field often. So it seems like you're most passionate about igniting the imagination and then actually giving people an experience of that. Can you tell me if that rings true for you, and then just a little bit more about how you're seeing that lived out right now in your life?
Yeah. Well, the 12 years into our project of training missionaries in a more holistic way, Karen and I kind of looked at each other and said, this has been amazing, but it's flawed in some important ways, and we're going to have to do something about it. There were three things that we could see that needed change. One was we were trying to build community from the ground up about every 12 to 18 months with a whole new batch of young people. And the problem, one of the key problems, was that more and more of those young people were coming to us deeply broken by their own life experience. Single families, often neglectful parents, just abusive contexts. This is seminary students. So these are master's level students at a seminary, but big trust issues, and really, really hard to get past that in 12 months or 18 months, and really give people
if I can interrupt, because I feel like this is part of the damage our paradigms cause. The idea that we could get them past that with a temporal relationship of 12 months, knowing that we're not going to be in their life the rest of their life, is absolutely ludicrous, against our very brain, the way God designed our brain and heart to work. Like, these are supposed to be lifelong relationships, Hesed relationships that are, I'm going to be with you no matter what, forever, or for at least the next duration. because that's what it takes to grow and mature and form healthy bonds. And so here, our culture says, we're going to put you together for 12 months and let you do intimate, deep, and learn intimate, deep community. And then you're going to rip your soul apart, and we're going to send you off to church plant somewhere and try to go rebuild that with other people from scratch. Like, really? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I was describing this to Carl Lehman and in his house outside of Chicago 7 or 8 years ago, and he just kind of laughed in my face. He said, that can't work, right? and for the reasons that you're describing, just someone who's thought deeply about how people get healed of their brokenness. So that was one of the things that we were just seeing more and more. It's just not going to work going forward to try to do this in this amount of time with these people in this circumstance. The second thing that was really becoming so clear to us is, and none of these people really even have an imagination for what it's like to be a part of an extended intergenerational family. They have no vision for it, and they have no desire for it. They've spent their whole life, nearly all of their waking hours, with people their own age. That's how our society, our school system, our church system, everything is set. You hang out with your peers, you hang out with your peers, you keep hanging out with your peers. Their imagination for life in Chicago or in Orlando or Singapore is, I'll go hang out with my peers. And it'll be us young singles, and then us young couples, and then us young families, and we'll find some friends. Well, the way that works out is, of course, everybody is exhausted within a few months of trying to hold down a full-time job, care for all the challenges of getting there and back in an urban setting, clothe yourself, feed yourself, and then children come along. If you have any moment of time to get with anybody else, it has to be scheduled 3 weeks in advance or 5 weeks in advance, and it's somebody else that's in your own same crazy, ridiculous place. Peers. No imagination for what would it be like if I had teenagers around and grandparents around and spiritual uncles and aunts that are deeply connected and are available for wisdom, for counsel, for relief, for an evening, for crying out loud, from the children. Just no imagination for what extended family could be or should be. And so without that imagination, again, we're just setting people up for guaranteed failure. So that was a second thing. And the third thing that was hitting us really hard is, and these guys have no sense of how important it is to stay put unless God calls you to not stay put, and so the lack of stability undermines everything you would try to do in terms of building true community and true intergenerationality, right? A new job comes along. You've been at it for 3 or 4 years with this group. You're getting close. You're loving each other. But hey, this is a career advance. So see you later, guys. So job or my desire to live in a more tropical climate trumps everything about the call of God and the community that God's given me. And we realize, wow, without a different kind of fundamental understanding of what it is to be a called out community, a called together community that really has each other's back and is helping each other discern the big moves. We're not going to be able to do this either. So all of that led to, I'm getting to your question here. All of that led to us feeling like, what we need is a demonstration plot. We need a joyful, interdependent, intergenerational community of God's love living here and now in Abilene that can invite young people alongside to participate in some of our rhythms, to watch how this works, to begin to catch a vision for intergenerationality and stability so that they can be formed into something that actually is going to be doable and sustainable wherever God calls them. So
I know we connected with you when we found Luke 10 because we had the same vision for Uruguay, for a place in Uruguay like that called San Geronimo that's still there before God followed us out of Uruguay and decided to have Uruguayans do that vision for us. But that I know Matt and you and all of us just bonded over that vision for that, because that's definitely in our in our DNA, our makeup as well. And we experienced all of those things you talked about, which
Yes.
of course your deepest calling a lot of times comes out of your deepest pain. So my question, okay, that I've been holding on to since the very beginning of this call is, what, with all of this passion burning inside of you, what in the world would take you to leave your parents
Yeah.
and not return to them, or not beg them to come live on the property with you? Like, this seems to me like a grieving, like,
Yeah.
and almost a God, like, why? But like, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, we were just good Americans, right? American kids, they go off to college. Bye, mom and dad. See you later. We've got our career. They've got theirs. They bless us. They love us. We visit them some. They visit us some. This
And
is
I
the
say this
American
real
way.
quick, letting everyone know that your parents are pretty amazing people. I mean, they're people you wouldn't want to leave. I'm just saying.
No.
Some people are like, man, I want to leave my parents. I don't ever want to look back. But you've
Yeah.
got some really cool ones.
Yep. Yeah, no, I don't think it ever occurred to them. It certainly didn't occur to us that we would just settle in close to them and be, biological extended family together. And like you say, there should be, and there is a tenderness and a sadness about that, especially as I was saying earlier, as they get into this season of life. We have done everything but take a crowbar to them to try to extract them from their part of the world to come be with us. They had some experiences of Texas summer long ago that I think persuaded them that they don't want to live in Texas. But it is the interesting thing about this journey that God has us on. Jesus points this out in multiple places. Is sometimes it includes biological family. Sometimes it includes a spiritual extended family, a kinship group that God calls out together. And sometimes it's a combination of both. But whatever it is, the determining factor is the call of God. And, we have to always leave open in the wisdom of God that sometimes he's going to call biological families to different places to do different things. Certainly that happened in the life of some of the earliest Christians. So we don't want to idealize or kind of try to make normative the experience of any one person or any one family. But what we do want to make normative is that we always are called into family. There's no such thing as a Lone Ranger Christian. That's simply not in the design of God for human beings, because God is not a Lone Ranger God. God is a community. We're made in God's image. We're called into community. So, so I think it cuts straight across the American grain, and especially how we have lived since the 40s and 50s of the last century, to prioritize extended family and stability. We've just culturally gone a completely different direction. But I think people who are looking at how our culture is coming unraveled at the seams, and where Western culture has now begun to infiltrate the rest of the majority world, we see those cultures coming apart at the seams in a way that's unprecedented in their history, because we're taking apart the historic overlay in people's lives between family and food and fun and faith and fields of work. That's how human beings have normally lived in most of the world for most of history. And this 100-year experiment in the West that began largely in the States, that thinks that we can just get along just fine without those things being overlaid, is, I think, being seen for what it is, a grand fragmentation of the humanity of human beings, and our capacity even to see and to love one another as we're designed to. We need extended family in order to grow up into who we're made to be. That's how we're designed by God. So intergenerational, interdependent communities of God's love. That's my current definition of what a vibrant family of Jesus is.
Yeah. So we're almost at time, but we can go on because we don't have anything else scheduled. If you have a 5 or 10 more minutes.
Sure.
Okay. Because I think we touched on something a few weeks ago in a debrief of your regenerative culture workshop that I want to bring up. And that is like I can relate to what you're saying because I had parents who held me in their heart, right? Like we left for 18 years and went to a different country, thousands and thousands of miles away. And but my parents held me in their heart in such a power, and they had created community with me so much and belonging and identity that it was in my experience to create that for others. And so when we went to Uruguay, we knew we were creating family. Like we needed family first, and that was church for us because we would die otherwise, right? And so it took us 15 years to create a family of about 30 people. We had a wonderful extended intergenerational family. And then of course God followed us out, and then we had to leave that family, which tore us apart, and come back. But now I get my biological family again here, which is about 25 people. So it's such a weird sort of thing that I've lived that was kind of both things. And now I have this beautiful Luke 10 family that I don't get to like live physically with, but yet I work with, and I connect heart to heart with, and listen to God with, and y'all disciple me, and you're growing me. And so it's this really weird thing. And a lot of people in Luke 10 have found Luke 10 because they don't know anyone locally who speaks their language, who even wants to be intimate emotionally and spiritually, doesn't want to listen to God with them. And so, there's people all over who hear this imagination for intergenerational community, and it's beyond their grasp right now. And they're not promised that it will ever happen to them or that they'll ever feel like they belong in one. And, that, I mean, it breaks my heart. One, I also think that it's, that's one of the longings of people is to belong, right? To a family, to people that would love them and accept them no matter what. And so I just want to ask you, I know your heart breaks and is very tender for that reality. But just reactions and thoughts and comments as you've processed this a little bit and seen what that's like when people come and visit you and then have to leave, and and that gets stirred up. And, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's so real and so true. I mean, I think if you just pick any 10 movies, coming out of Hollywood these days, they all almost invariably either speak to the brokenness of relationships and how flawed and fractured and frail human existence is, or they talk about the longing for community and family. I mean, and often it's the mixture, right? It's the distance between the ideal that we long for and the lived experience that so many people face. I think we have to enter this topic, like every other topic, in the awareness that we're in an already not yet situation here, right? The kingdom of God is breaking in. The reign of God is breaking in. The mission of God is the life of God, and the mission of Jesus is the life of God on earth as it is in heaven. And the mission of the community of Jesus is the life of God here and now. That's, broadly speaking, that's the story that we live in. But we're on the way too, and so any individual who finds himself saying, that sounds great, but I just don't see it. It's not happening for me. I think, that's a good place to start, because when we can name the situation as it is, then we can begin to pray very fervently to the Lord of the harvest, who builds his church. We don't build his church. He builds his church for that person of peace. Where's the person of peace, Lord? And it may start, as you say, very well may start in a virtual relationship as we're learning even the skills of connecting with another person. When John White first started saying, as close to daily as possible, practice these disciplines, I just thought, you know, once a week's got to be good enough. You know, with all this touchy-feely stuff, once a week, okay, I can give you that. You know, daily, oh man, that seemed like such a hurdle. But the longer, obviously, you go into this, the more you realize, oh, well, you don't have a meal once a week. You know, we are designed to be sustained and nurtured by the human relationships that God gives us. And so I think the Lord is endlessly creative in helping us find the community that we need for the formation that we're ready for in the season of life we're in. But I think God is always, by the Spirit, relentlessly drawing us into physical family that can be there for us, whether that's the biological family or the extended kingdom family. I think that's God's intention. And I think we, in our time, desperately need lots more of those demonstration plots of the good news. And we know how this story ends, right? It is a bride made up of people from every tribe and tongue and family on earth. You know, so how does that happen? Well, the Luke 10 vision is penultimate. You know, we're not going to make that bride happen, but we can do our part, no more, no less, to see a vibrant family of Jesus in close reach of everyone worldwide. So the Johns like my friend John, the atheist, who are out there, can see that beautiful family up close and personal and get in on it, be ready to sell everything they have. I think that's the vision, that's the opportunity that's before us. And to me, that's a treasure that's worth giving up everything to have.
Thank you. I don't think that's like mic drop right there, Kent.
Well, it's such a joy to get to be with you, dear friend and sister. So glad for the companionship we have shared and what lies ahead.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for letting me probe and ask questions. And, you know, I've heard these stories, goodness gracious, probably 10 times, and I don't tire of hearing them. And I really am amazed at how well you remember and how you've kind of, what's the word, siphoned it down to, you know, very core principles and very core memories with these 3 things. And then there was this memory and that was 3 things. I'm like, how does one do that with their lifelong story that's so long?
Lots of experience with.
You've experienced so much. So to distill it, that's the word, to distill it down the way you have, that you tell it almost the same way each time, is absolutely amazing, by the way. And I'm like taking notes on, oh man, I really need to get mine down like this, because I'm only going to get older and it's only going to need to be shorter. How do I do this? So thank you for modeling for us too, how to really reflect on our story enough so that we've even listened to God and know what those important moments were and what he was teaching us in those moments and how that shaped us and where that brought us today. And I just see that in the way you tell your story. And it's so enjoyable and really inspiring. So thank you for doing it yet again, and for sharing with us today. I really appreciate it.
Love you, sis. Y'all have a blessed rest of the day.
I'm going to end session. I'll see you later.
See ya.
Bye.